Hi, it's Margaret, and thank you for joining me here on the Gardening Me. We had some beautiful weather again this week, and I decided I was going to clean up my beds just a little bit earlier than I normally do. My west border has a large number of perennials to cut back, and it also has a lot of bulbs, so it's usually the one that I start with at the beginning of the season. I have had this pile of mulch sitting here for a good portion of last year, so I figured this was a good time to finally put it in the bed. Once the perennials in this bed really get going, it's much more challenging to add mulch. And it's been several years since this bed has received a good layer of mulch, so I'm really excited to get it on and finally get those drip lines covered up. The only tools I generally use in spring cleanup are a set of pruners. I get out my weeder as well, which is a cobra head to deal with any kind of weeds that I run into. And I have this ginormous garden bag, is what it's called. And it's kind of like a cross between a tarp and a bag. And when I'm doing spring cleanup, usually there is a lot of volume, but it doesn't weigh very much. So this bag is perfect for that. I'll put the link in the description below if you want to check it out. For me, spring cleanup consists mainly of cutting back the dead stems on the perennials, which I leave standing all winter long. There are a few reasons why leaving your cleanup until spring is a good idea. Firstly, of course, there are the critters that hibernate in those hollow stems and the leaf litter. Then there's the winter interest. I enjoy looking at a landscape full of seed heads and grasses that are swaying. The other reason why leaving all that top growth over the winter and waiting as long as possible to cut it all back is that that top growth protects the crowns of the plants over the winter. I truly think that this is one reason why I usually have really good luck with plants surviving the winter in our garden. Now I'm going to knock on wood here. This winter that we've just had has been so incredibly mild that we had the least amount of snow cover that I can ever recall. I think I shoveled our front walkway once all winter, which is unheard of. Lack of that insulating snow, together with all the swings in temperature we had this winter, it might end up causing a bit of havoc in my garden. We'll have to wait and see in the next few weeks to find out how many casualties there are, and I'm crossing my fingers that there won't be many. When you're doing spring cleanup, there's a little bit of a balancing act, I find. You want to kind of leave it as late as possible because there are hibernating critters in the leaf debris and in the stems and, in the garden in general. But if I do it too late, then I find myself practically doing some acrobatics to avoid stepping on bulbs and new perennial growth. It's also much more tedious to remove all that old growth when you have a bunch of new growth already coming in and it's kind of in the way. For me, the bottom line when it comes to the garden in general is that every garden is different and every gardener is different as well. You have to do what works for you and what works for your garden. And don't feel guilty about it, one way or the other. I have a few gardening friends that do a bit of cleanup in the fall and then a bit of cleanup in the spring just to lighten that load. And that's perfectly okay. In the past, I would usually wait until the beginning of April to do my spring cleanup. It's early enough so that the ground is still partially frozen, but late enough that I feel many of the critters are already out and about. Also, by that point, our frigid winter temps are behind us, so I'm not really that concerned about winter damage to those perennial crowns. In the past few years, though, by early April, the bulbs and the perennials are already well on their way, and I find myself doing some of those garden acrobatics to keep from stepping on them. This year, I actually had pushed that cleanup back to the end of March, but with this super mild winter weather, I decided to up my timing a bit more to mid March. And I already see a lot of things coming up in the beds. There are a couple of plants that I covered with straw in the late fall last year because they're marginally hardy in our area, and I will be leaving that straw in place up until probably mid April or so. Right at the start of the season, it's a little easy to get carried away and overdo it because you're not used to all that gardening activity after having been on hiatus basically all winter long. I generally try to do maybe one border a day or two depending on the size. So I try to cut it off at a particular point in time just so that I'm not really achy the next day. When I clean up the beds, I do try to be mindful of a few things. Even though the ground is half frozen, or at the very least it's not sodden, I try not to step all over the place unnecessarily. And because I know that there very well may be some hibernating critter in these stems, I try not to damage them. I don't bend them, I don't cut them up, I put them in my bag just as is. Now, as I mentioned, the critters not only hide in plant stems, but they also hide in the leaf litter in the garden beds. And that I leave untouched. I never rake out my garden beds. I don't really feel the need to. I consider the leaves basically like a free soil amendment. And in my garden, I've never had an issue with the leaves suffocating the plants or anything like that, so I just leave them be. There are a few perennials that I'm not cutting back for a couple more weeks, including the lavender and Russian sage. I also won't be cutting back my roses and panicle hydrangeas for at least a few more weeks, probably around the middle of April or so. I am running into weeds every now and again, and I make sure to pull them now before they're hidden by bulbs and perennials. And look at this. I am absolutely thrilled by this little grouping of violas that I grew from seed last year. Now here's a patch of feverfew, and as you can see, there's some beautiful green growth on it. I grew feverfew for the first time last year, and from what I've read, most people treat this as an annual, so they'll sow it every year. I figured I would see what happens with it this year and just let it be. I'm cutting back all the dead stems on it, and we'll see whether it gets lanky and ratty and it is really best sowing it fresh every year, or whether I can get a nice stand of it just happening here as a perennial. When I get to trimming my hydrangeas in a few weeks, this baby oak leaf hydrangea won't be one of them. It's still a baby for one, so I'll only prune off any dead stems once it starts to leaf out. Once it gets larger, if I did want to prune it for shape, I would only do that right after it blooms, as the buds for next year's flowers are actually formed in late summer. So if I pruned it now, I would be pruning all of those blooms off. I found a couple of self-seeded pine trees, white pine I'm assuming. Now this isn't the first time I've found pine seedlings in this border, and what I have done in the past is dug them up and placed them in a pot and left them there for a year or two in the pot to size up, and then placed them out into the landscape. And it's worked out quite well. So I decided to dig these up and do the same thing. So this garden bag is huge, and I actually only had to empty it out twice over this entire border. And what I do is I empty it out in an area that's kind of out of the way on top of our hill. And this is where all of the plant debris will stay until around early summer. By that point, any critters will have vacated the premises, and that's when I'll put the piles into the compost. And now for the mulch. As it turns out, when I went to dig into the big pile of mulch, I found that it was frozen a few inches in, so I really couldn't use a shovel to really get in there, and I had to basically resort to scooping it into buckets, whatever was unfrozen on the top. I wasn't able to get enough unfrozen mulch to do the entire bed, but I would say that 80% of it was done. I'll finish it up in the next week or so as more of that mulch defrosts. The garden is looking a little bare right now. It won't be too much longer though until we start seeing some green growth, and usually once that gets going, it's kind of full speed ahead. It goes from a little drib and a little drab here and there to an explosion of growth. Thank you for joining me today, and we will see you next time. Bye.